My apologies, folks, for the technical problems. I've been kicked off the internet 4 times this morning. Think I've got it solved now, but we're going to run the interview again, and I encourage you to
The Prime Minister lied and his minions continue to lie.
we need political change. But we also need to resolve to resist. Yes, please subscribe, like the station, helps us beat the algorithm. So we're going to try again. Thank you for tuning back in. And this is a great interview with Gordon, and I know you're going to love it. So here we go again. Pleasure to have Gord Magill with me today. And Gord, of course, has been following the, shall we say, misfortunes of the Coutts 2. And these, of course, were the two guys who were involved in the I don't want to say the how would you describe what they did, Gord?
They stood up for your right to, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom to have a job, just like everybody else in the Freedom Convoy. They protested at the Coutts border crossing between Alberta and Montana during the Freedom Convoy protests, which were all across the country. And February 13th and 14th, 2022, the RCMP raided the site and arrested 13 people, arrested a couple of people in other locations as well. And 4 of those gentlemen were charged with some pretty heinous crimes, conspiracy to murder police officers amongst them. And the sort of process to get those guys to court and to settle all this stuff was pretty long. 2 of the gentlemen had all the original charges against them dropped, Jerry Morin and Chris Lysak. Almost 2 years to the day of their arrest, as a matter of fact. But Tony Olienick and Chris Carbert went to trial, were found not guilty of conspiracy to murder police officers, but were found guilty of lesser charges. And let's just say that the entire procedure, the whole process, their incarceration, their denial of bail, things that the Crown prosecutor was up to, things the RCMP did, were not all above board. The media were especially loathsome in trying to get these guys convicted in the court of public opinion. And there was just a lot of really bad vibes with this trial. Tony Olienick and Chris Carbert remain in custody at the Drumheller Institution in Alberta. They applied for parole basically as soon as they could. The parole hearing was on April 25th. And much like the trial itself, it was a sham. And the conclusion, the result, was baked into the cake, as I put it in the piece. Clearly, from the documents from the parole officers and from everybody involved at Drumheller, it appears that orders came from above to make sure the verbiage, rhetoric in the documents show that they were not denied parole based on typical factors, right? Like, what's your recidivism score? What's the likelihood you're going to be a danger to the community? Have you made any progress while you've been in behind bars? How's your behavior been? Because on all of those fronts, they were perfect prisoners, but were denied parole anyway. And it's very clear that they were denied parole because the government doesn't believe that Chris and Tony have kissed the ring, have admitted any fault. It was cited that they have an appeal against their convictions. I mean, basically, the government is saying because these guys won't plead guilty and continue to maintain their innocence, that's reason to deny them parole.
Yeah, that's what I find most interesting about this, because when I was reading the CBC article, which I think reveals more than the CBC probably wanted to reveal.
It sure did.
It's quite interesting because, it says 7 months into the remaining 31 31-month sentence. Carbert applied for parole. A hearing took place before 2 Parole Board of Canada members. You have dedicated yourself to personal growth through various educational and spiritual activities, reads the Parole Board report. The board's 10-page recently released decision sheds light on Carbert's progress in prison and the reason the board denied him release on both day and full parole. The decision notes that Carbert completed his high school diploma, worked 3 prison jobs, attended Bible college, and completed vocational tickets. Carbert is described in the document as quiet and respectful, having not demonstrated any evidence of an attitude or disrespect for authority. During his hearing, the board noted Carbert described attending the Coutts protest as the worst decision you have ever made. In sentencing Carbert and co-accused Anthony Olenick, the judge noted there was a credible threat to police and the public. Now, when I read this, it sounds to me like a Stalinist show trial where you were not just found guilty. They expected you to get on your knees and beg for forgiveness and renounce everything you've done, to give complete repentance for the so-called crime. And unless you did that, and if you didn't get a bullet in the back of the head first from the NKVD, you were never going to be adjudicated as a worthy person who was ever going to get out of prison. And that, of course, when I'm reading this, it's the sanction. They want the sanction of the victim. Here they are saying, unless you show your complete remorse for this, forget it. You're not going to get parole. I'm just surprised they didn't decide to add on to their sentence, because this is
it seems like
outrageous.
It seems like that's something that they would have done. So I had access to documents from the intake parole officers when they first showed up at Drumheller, and then numerous other documents that were issued in their stay between when they arrived and when the parole hearings took place on April 25th. They were issued new parole officers in January, and right off the bat in those reports, in those documents, those 2 new parole officers that they were issued were immediately not caring, dismissing all of their good behavior, all of their actual factors of their stay, and made it about the trial again. The one parole officer in particular was very fixated on Tony Olienick's supposed attitude. He is cited for asking for real cheese instead of like fake cheese because Tony's very health conscious. He famously had a very difficult time getting probiotics because he suffers from SIBO, sort of a small intestinal disorder. And because he asked for real cheese, this parole officer said like he had an attitude problem and like he was entitled, and that he didn't, he didn't care about what he had done to the people of Canada. And in other reports, they keep saying, like these guys haven't taken ownership of the damage they've caused and, the threat they represent to Canadians. And it's like, what damage? They didn't hurt anybody. They didn't rob anybody. They didn't do anything except stand around at a protest site and then have a conspiracy theory thrown at them, for which they were dragged through the mud in the media and then went through a sham trial, and they've been in jail for 3.5 years. Maintaining your innocence and, maintaining your own sense of like dignity and your opinion is not a cause for you to not come out of jail, unless, of course, it's Stalinist Russia, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I find this comment from the judge, Justice David Lebrenz, absolutely incredible. And he says, when asked about the harm he had caused, Carbert noted the inconvenience he'd created for people looking to travel across the border, which is precisely what he did cause. Inconvenience. As you write in your Substack, he did not rob anybody. He did not hurt anybody. But the board found this was one example of Carbert's attempts to minimize his involvement and evidence of cognitive distortion. So he's a little bit crazy.
Right. Well, it's thought crime, and you'll see with Carbert too. I cite some verbiage from those parole officers. At one point, they said you were stockpiling food. So if you're somebody who's like quote unquote a prepper, or there's a book coming out from a gentleman here in the United States who's trying to flip the script on this idea. He refers to such folks as resilient citizens, people who are prepared, people who are thinking about disasters, or and just being ready for what life throws at you. According to those parole officers, that was another reason to keep them in jail as evidence of their distorted thinking. So basically, when you boil down what these parole officers are saying is that they were denying parole to Chris and Tony for their continued guilt of thought crime. They do not think like us, right? And there was a meeting, in one of these meetings at Drumheller, it was relayed to me on the phone from Tony and Chris, that this parole officer said out loud for everybody to hear, "I wish more of you guys would have been arrested at the border." So like this parole officer was issued to their case and came out guns blazing, taking the government side of everything and relitigating the case.
Well, yeah, precisely. And this judge goes on to say that you demonstrated a lack of accountability for your actions, particularly as it relates to the stockpiling of firearms and ammunition and their intended purposes. So I picked up on that too. It's like we were in the midst of the COVID pandemic when this whole thing occurred, and we all can remember that. We were under lockdowns, we were under COVID mandates, and of course, the government was creating a crisis. And so, are we not supposed to react to that in some way of self-preservation or looking after our friends and family?
It's not illegal to own.
Obviously,
It's not illegal in Canada to own guns. Well, at least not yet. Shotguns and rifles, if you have a PAL, are perfectly legal to have. There's not really any. I mean, I think there might be some technical weight limit on how much ammunition you're allowed to have, but like all kinds of people have guns and ammo hanging around at home. Like this is not a crime.
yeah. And they were still trying to drag out that pipe bomb.
Right.
Crap,
Yeah. They cited that a number of times too. And it's like, okay, I mean, yeah, technically they couldn't produce a permit for an industrial explosive that was over a decade old in storage at Tony's property, 200 kilometers away from the protest site, which was a leftover from when Tony and his now deceased father ran like a quarrying operation, right? So, the government used that to like pad their case. The Crown prosecutor, the cops, everybody knew that it had nothing to do with the protest, but it was just an easy score to pad the case and another way to smear these guys.
Yeah, it's quite evident. And of course, recently we had the guilty verdict for Chris Barber and Tamara Lich. And I was very disappointed. I didn't hear anything out of Pierre Poilievre about that. There was no indication that there was disgust over that verdict, because these two clearly should never have been even charged with mischief. But what worries me here, Gord, is that once again we've got people charged with mischief. Okay, there was the added charge of possession of a weapon, a firearm, and they tried to make the most out of this. But what this really comes down to, though, and as you have said from the beginning, this is nothing more than another mischief charge. And these guys, 6.5 years in prison for a mischief charge. And of course, I'm very concerned about what's going to happen to Chris Barber and Tamara Lich when they come back for their sentencing. Chris was in Ottawa yesterday, trying to get a stay on some of the other the other charges. But the chill factor is enormous here for me, because as I'm sure you remember during the Liberal leadership campaign, Mark Carney was in Kelowna, and he made a point of saying that he is going to use emergency powers to push through his legislation and his
Yes,
policies.
he did say
And
that. Yep.
he warned us, but Canadians were incredibly delusional, inept, stupid, and could not see through this guy through a campaign. The sham of a campaign. This was a sham trial, but it was a sham election campaign with Mark Carney coming out swinging every day against Donald Trump, and of course, Donald Trump ends up endorsing Mark Carney 3 times.
Yeah,
So
a lot.
of
There's
game.
plenty of psyops here, and it's as you say, when they parachuted Carney in, and then because the media in Canada are bought and paid for, they pivoted. Right, they immediately went from the election should have been a referendum on Justin Trudeau and his rule for the last 9 years, and they made it about Trump immediately. And then all these clapping seals, CBC Canadians just went right along with it.
Yeah, that is precisely what happened. And I remember saying that back in November. When Trudeau went down to visit Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago, I said, hey, this is what the next campaign is going to be about, whether it's Justin Trudeau or somebody else. The Liberal Party has made a conscious decision here to run against Donald Trump, not Pierre Poilievre. They're running against Donald Trump. And my God, it worked. And it even worked when it was blatantly obvious that Trump and Carney were playing a game. And I'm a huge fan of Donald Trump, but I was not a huge fan of Donald Trump endorsing Mark Carney. I think it was very, very foolish. Unless his raison d'etre for that was to literally break up Canada. And if that's what he's after, well, he probably endorsed the right guy. But if he wants to work with a Canadian prime minister who will see things in the same light, he endorsed the wrong guy. And there's no question about that. But this concerns me. This is right after this horrible verdict for Tamara, Lich, and Chris Barber. We get this denial of parole for the Coutts too. And I can tell you, if I was I'm a journalist. I'm covering these stories. I covered the Freedom Convoy. It was one of the most transformational stories I've ever covered. It literally changed the way I think about a lot of issues. And it amazes me how people on the right and the left changed the way they thought about things because of what the government was doing to us during the COVID pandemic. But if I wanted to protest a government decision now, I would be very reluctant to do that for fear of losing my job, for fear of being arrested and accused of heinous crimes and getting 6.5 years in prison for merely saying I disagree with where this government is coming from.
Well, that's the point. That's the whole point. They don't want anybody protesting their rule. They want you to know that if you are in a disfavored protest, they will stop at nothing to smear you, crush your business. I mean, look at what they're trying to do to Chris Barber, right? In all of the other charges against other convoy protesters, and there's been many. I mean, there's, we hear the big names, but there's been hundreds and hundreds of other people who've gone to trial over their participation in the convoy. None of those people have faced property seizure, right? But Chris Barber, they want to take his truck and they want to destroy it, right? Because of the symbolic value, right? Big Red, that 2003 Kenworth W900L that we've all seen photos of and video of, and that led the western portion of the convoy into Ottawa, this symbol of freedom to Canadians, They want it. They want to destroy it because they want to send another message. Don't you dare protest. Don't you dare, get in the way of our program or get in the way of our rule. And you're seeing the same thing here with this denial of parole. It doesn't matter that Tony Olienick and Chris Carbert have been model prisoners. It doesn't matter that they've got jobs at prison. It doesn't matter that the people that run Drumheller think so highly of Tony that he gets to be the receiver and they trust him to not let drugs get into the joint, right? It doesn't matter that, like, under any metrics, they shouldn't even be there. By the parole metrics, by the scales and the recidivism charts, like they should be out, right? But that doesn't matter. They're in there because the government wants you to know, don't you dare think that you can stand up to us or get in the way of our program. It's really that simple.
Yeah, I think it really is that simple. And whether it's Justin Trudeau or Mark Carney, we're seeing more of the same. And it's the politics from the judges that I find most disturbing, telling these people that they don't have a right to think differently. And that to me is absolutely worrisome, to say the least. But I'm very concerned that we're going to see the reintroduction of the Online Harms Act here in Canada with Mark Carney. He alluded to it during the campaign. He talked about the need to protect children. And of course, that bill has nothing to do with protecting children. Children are already protected. It has everything to do, and he did as an afterthought say, and we have to protect people from misinformation and disinformation. And that, of course, is all this government is about when it comes down to it. They want your free speech to be taken away.
Yeah, if they were concerned about misinformation and disinformation, they would simply defund the CBC. Right? That'd be the end of it. So,
well, Gord, the day after the April 28th election, I woke up. Well, I was up virtually all night anyway, but I was writing my stories in the morning and preparing a broadcast. And I said, damn it, the one thing I probably resent most of all is that we're not going to see the CBC defunded, because that's an issue I have worked on. It's been a personal project of mine for years. I actually produced a paper on why we needed to defund the CBC, all the reasons for defunding it, and not just because it's a sham liberal media organization, but I always argued that if it's so damn good, if the CBC is such high quality journalism, then surely to God they can survive without $1.3 billion in taxpayer subsidy. So I remember going around the conservative MPs with my paper, and I was working for a think tank at the time, and nobody wanted to entertain the idea of defunding the CBC. Pierre Poilievre has been the first conservative leader who's actually talked about it seriously, and I really believe he would have followed through with that. That to me was the litmus test for Pierre Poilievre. If you stop talking about defunding the CBC, I ain't listening anymore. He didn't stop talking. He didn't stop talking about it. But when I woke up April 29th, I said that's the thing I really regret the most, is that we're going to be saddled with the CBC, extra money. Carney wants to give it extra money now.
Yeah, another $100 million a year,
and continue the subsidies to the mainstream media in this country. And if people can't see there's something wrong with the media being bought off, and you reference this time and time again in this Substack piece of how the mainstream media has been completely bought off by the government. And how can you even take them seriously? But that to me is another lesson learned here, is that I don't know if this country is going to survive Mark Carney. If this government falls within 6 months, I think it has a chance. If it doesn't, I don't think it has a chance. Have you been following the Alberta independence movement in the last couple of months?
I've been watching it from afar. I'm not 100% sure what to make of it because, like, I'm not in Alberta, and we tend to get siloed online. We get algorithmic siloing, and we all sort of hang out in our own little echo chambers. No matter how hard we try and get out of them, but it's interesting that that movement is basically like at its its peak, its highest amount of discussion right now, downstream of Mr. Carney's election. You mentioned the CBC here again. I want to point out that CBC article about the guys, about their denial of parole. It was most like it revealed a few things that I don't think the CBC sort of meant to come across that way. You sort of had to read between the lines, but they are guilty of omitting something, which, omission, lying by omission is a thing, is that they didn't mention that the main parole officer was a former cop, a retired police officer by the name of Mark Chatterbach, who was the deputy chief of police for the city of Saskatoon. Whatever. I mean, that's fine. But when you have a case that was built around this extremely salacious and highly charged accusation that these guys were going to murder cops, right? And then all of the rhetoric about that in the media has been about that charge, even though they were found not guilty of it. And then their main parole officer, who decides whether or not they get out of jail, is also a police officer. I mean, come on, guys. I think the CBC should have let you know, just so that you understand what was going on here. And they failed to mention that the lead parole officer was in fact this cop.
And you're saying that because that would give him a bias against the granting parole?
You think? Yeah, I mean, if you're a career police officer and the two people in front of you were accused of wanting to kill one of your fellow cops, I mean, that's going to weigh on your mind. I don't think there's any way that Mr. Chatterbach could have, set aside his bias towards his former colleagues, given that he did 38 years on the force. I think that would have been very difficult for him. And people needed to know that. People need to know that there's these factors at play when we're talking about the government and talking about people's lives. And the CBC failing to mention that in their article is indicative.
Yeah. And I would encourage people to read your Substack there. And there it is, that I was perusing last night and this morning. It's very comprehensive. And that's extremely comprehensive.
I'm guilty of kind of overdoing it sometimes. I do write for other publications and I have to deal with editors. But when I get the chance to write things on my own Substack where I am the editor and it's my ship, I want to make sure people reading it have got as much information, as much context as possible. So it's fairly long. But I cite all of these documents that have been forwarded to me, and because people need to know what's going on here. So thank you for reading it. And
Well, I just want to read the one or two paragraphs. I think you really have made some excellent points here. When you say documents I have been forwarded regarding the various stages of Tony and Chris's parole process indicate a very clear political angle to discussions by parole officers tasked with assessing their case. Much of the case against Tony and Chris was built on things Tony is alleged to have said to undercover officers, with no recordings or evidence to back up these highly salacious and inflammatory claims. Yet those claims heavily informed Tony and Chris's parole decisions, just as they were repeatedly intoned by Justice David Labrenz during the sentencing. The parole decisions for both men were essentially re-litigations of their trial. Excellent point. I think that's exactly what happened, with any other factors more or less dismissed, which reveal the political nature of those decisions. And I think this coming on the heels of Mark Carney winning this election, of the conviction of Tamara and Chris. And as you mentioned, I had forgotten that they want to take his truck away. I mean, that is just phenomenal. How could any government that would take your livelihood away just to be spiteful? And I went to 95% of those trial dates, and it just amazed me how I never heard a shred of evidence in any of those trial dates about actual mischief being committed by either of these two. And as far as I was concerned, the prosecution ran a gong show because every time they would play a video or a recording, it hurt their case. It would be Chris or Tamara talking about, be sure you protest peacefully, respect the police, respect a property, respect the citizens of the city. But of course, the judge has the nerve to say that Chris and Chris and Tony. Chris and Tony were infringing upon the rights of Alberta and Canadians. That was a kicker for me.
It's facile.
Because if it wasn't for people like Chris and Tony and Chris Barber and Tamara Lich, Canadians would have lost their rights. The only reason we were not subject to more lockdowns and more of the spurious COVID mandates is because there were people like that with the guts to protest, who knew it was going to come back on them. It was going to bite them in the behind. They were going to have to pay for it, but they were prepared to do that courageously. And that's why I say about all of those, everyone involved in the Freedom Convoy, thank you for going out and doing that. Thank you for saving our rights in Canada. You turned things around. As I said, I don't know if Canada can survive Mark Carney. I don't know if this country is going to break up or not. I think there's never been a time in this nation's history where Alberta independence has been so viable and so potentially possible. And I've been watching Western separatism and Alberta separatism for decades, and I've never seen it this hot, and the numbers so close. So I think it's a real possibility that we could see the end of Canada. But
we could see the end of the political order. It's become obvious to anybody paying attention that the sort of Laurentian elite, the power center in Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal, are now a fully technocratic, administrative, managerial regime that have no consideration for the citizens or the people they're ruling over, and have been heavily infected with, globalism, and they're just not, it's not a democracy at all in any meaningful sense of the word. You got a fully controlled media. The system, the democratic system, is insulated itself from any serious reform, and they rule by fiat. And then you've got, this guy Carney gets parachuted in. Carney was an advisor to Trudeau. Carney wrote an op-ed in the Globe and Mail saying he should invoke the Emergencies Act. He's talking about using emergency legislation in order to push forward a climate agenda that nobody wants. And it's a dictatorship. It's some kind of like cacistocracy, like rule by the worst amongst us. And like the only solution, Alberta, why wouldn't they want to leave? I think everybody wants to leave. A lot of people I talk to back home want to move to the United States or leave the country in some capacity because they know that everything is shaky and things are really, really bad, right? And sooner or later, the real estate bubble is going to pop. Sooner or later, things are going to start falling apart. And the people running the show have got no idea how to fix it, no idea what makes things work, and no respect for the ideas and the principles that actually made Canada what it is and made it such a great place. And, I can't see it moving forward being the same thing that we grew up knowing what Canada is to be.
I'm hearing the same thing from a lot of people, even family members in Alberta who are fed up with Canada as it's currently constituted. So I think it's a very real possibility. But we have Trudeau and Mark Carney to thank for that, and a lot of too many Canadian voters who just could not see through this man and what
No,
he
they're,
really represents.
and they're very selfish and not thinking about the future, right? It's like, hey, we got our pension, we got our house paid off, we get to go on our vacations, life's good. Doesn't matter that it's not going to be that way for our kids and our grandkids who can't possibly ever afford a home here. We don't care that our economy now is built on an indentured servant class that we imported from other countries, and we'll just as easily toss them aside as we've done to our own citizens. Like the people who run Canada and the people who support the Liberal Party or the NDP are just the most thoughtless, careless, selfish people on earth, and they are going to let Canada slip down this slope into perfidy and damnation.
I have to agree, Gord, and this is a pivotal time in our history, and I think we made nationally we made the wrong decision on April 28th, and it might really come back to haunt us. But thank you so much for your time today, Gord. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Keep up the fight and keep up the great writing. And I think we're actually sharing a couple of publications because I'm writing for Substack, of course, as well, and Blaze.
Oh,
Media.
the Blaze, yeah. No, I hooked you up at the Blaze. I'm glad to see that they've taken your content and put it out there. You'll get some more Canadians on their platform. I'm glad you had me on. I'm always happy to speak on about this case. I don't want Chris and Tony to be forgotten. To your listeners, if you can, their legal fight carries on. They still have lawyers. There's going to be more. There are going to be appeals when they do get out, and the parole process costs money. So if you are in Canada, if you go to the bottom of my article, there's a couple of Interact email money transfer addresses. You can help out if you can, if you got any money left over, if you're of means. If you're in the United States or internationally, I have a Give Send Go that's been open for them for a year and a half now. GiveSendGo.com/Trudeau's political prisoners. Maybe I should update the title to Carney's political prisoners. I'll
make sure to put that in the description, Gord. And
awesome, thank you. Yeah, and then you can follow me on Twitter at Gord Magill or on Substack, autonomoustruckers.substack.com.
Thanks so much for joining me today, Gord, and we'll hook up again.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, and take care.
Okay, bye for now. You've been watching Stand on Guard with David Krayden, and that was Gord Magill. And the Autonomous Truckers, Substack writer, Blaze Media, great guy. It's a pleasure to have him on the show today. Thanks for watching. And of course, that was one of the most frustrating mornings I've ever had on YouTube, but we finally got that interview up. Internet finally working again. Guess I should have rebooted it. I just didn't think that was the problem. Anyway, we're back, and I'll be back again tomorrow at can't decide whether we're going to church or not. We're still a little bit under the weather, but thank you for your patience today. Thanks for watching, and continue to resist. God bless this country. Godspeed to all of you.